Stanford University.
Good evening, everyone. We're about midway through with the Stanford's State of the Union 2014 class. I want to remind you that we don't meet on election night, and we'll have a session following on the 11th to conclude our class. Tonight's session is on the topic of technology and social change, and because of the positions of the two guests that will be joining us tonight, we'll have a conversation, I'm sure, about a wide variety of topics, but we'll include in those the implications of technological change for education, continuing on some themes that we hit on last week. Format for the evening is the usual. Jim Steyer is going to start off with just a few framing remarks. We'll then introduce our two guests, Reed Hastings and Janet Napolitano, and give them each about 2 or 3 minutes to say a couple things about their take on the State of the Union, and then open conversation here on the stage. So, Jim.
Great. Thank you, Rob. So we are very lucky to have both Janet Napolitano and Reed Hastings here tonight. And I'm just going to make a few comments, no slides. Just a few comments, because in my day job, the focus of much of our work is on the fact that media and technology are basically the other parent in the lives of young people in our society, and have changed the nature of childhood, have changed the nature of education, and in some ways have set the stage for remarkable opportunities and progress on a lot of topics we're going to talk about tonight. Just a few framing remarks. One of the things that I think about all the time is the fact that the average kid today, 8 and up, spends about 56 hours a week with media and technology. 56 hours a week. I can tell you as the parent of 4, that's way more time than they spend with me. That's way more time than they spend in school. And that's the average. So if you're thinking about your own children or your grandchildren and thinking that there's no way they're doing 56 hours a week with media and technology, they're just bringing the average down to 56 hours a week. So the impact of that on our society is absolutely extraordinary. Now tonight, because of the depth and breadth of Janet's experience and Reed's experience, we have really 2 of the most interesting guests that we could possibly have. We're going to cover a range of topics. I personally hope that we're going to focus a fair amount on the impact of technology on education. We're going to look at it at the university level, where I'm sure we're going to be talking with both Janet and Reed about how technology can potentially transform university level education and potentially change the nature of schools like Stanford and the UC system. But we're also going to talk about it from a K through 12 perspective, because in a lot of the work that I do at Common Sense, we look at technology, used wisely, as an extraordinary lever, particularly for low-income kids, to get the kind of education, 21st century education, that they get. But because Janet has such a fascinating background as both the governor of Arizona, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and now the head of UC, we're clearly going to get into issues like privacy. We're going to get into issues like immigration and foreign policy and homeland security. We're going to look at the impact, I'm sure at some point, we've been talking about it over the course of the quarter, about technology and inequality in this society. So we're going to take a look. And the last thing I would say is this. We happen to live in this unique place in the United States that is really the home of much of this. Much of what we're going to talk about tonight has occurred and been built within a 20 or 30 mile radius of where we're all sitting here tonight. So I think it will be one of the most enjoyable and fascinating discussions we're going to have. And knowing both Janet and Reed as I do, I can assure you they're going to have a lot to say. So that's the framing. And Rob and David, let's turn it over to those guys and let them make their opening comments.
Great. Just add a few things by way of a full formal introduction for our 2 guests. Sitting here to my left is Janet Napolitano. She's the president of the University of California system here in California, which is the largest and also the best public research university in the entire world. That's despite the budget cuts. Prior to that, she served as the secretary for the Department of Homeland Security in Washington, D.C. between 2009 and 2013. And immediately prior to that, she was the governor of Arizona, where under her leadership, there was widespread experimentation with charter schools. She graduated locally from Santa Clara University, where she was the valedictorian. And one other thing I didn't know about her biography until I looked it up, she was, early on in her political career, served as counsel to Anita Hill during the Clarence Thomas hearings in Washington, D.C. So turn it over to you, Janet, and then I'll introduce Reed for your 2 minutes.
Well, thanks. So the theoretical topic tonight is education and technology, but we can already tell from the intro the conversation will be much more broad-ranging. But on the particular topic of technology and education, I think where higher education is concerned, what's happening now is a very interesting thing in the United States, which is to say, the old model where you went to high school and then you went to a 4-year school and you got your bachelor's, and then if you wanted to, you went to professional school or graduate school, what have you. That model is fracturing. And there are lots of different models that are going on now. And everything from your traditional residential small liberal arts college to major public research universities, but to online universities, to for-profit universities, and the like. So part of the conversation ought to be about is that actually changed for good or not? Are we actually improving the accessibility of and excellence of higher education? I think technology is a tool in this evolution. I think the notion of a few years ago that there was going to be a huge tsunami in higher education because of technology has not proven to be the case, but what has proven to be the case is different ways of using technology, hybrid classes, collaborative learning, all kinds of ways to enrich the student experience. We use it in all different types of ways at the University of California. Everything from providing access to courses on one campus that you'd like to take even if you're on another campus, to courses where part of the course is taught online and part of it is in a setting with your fellow students or in a laboratory or a design studio or the like, and lots of other modalities in between. And what does that mean? What I think it means is that technology will make higher education better. Last point, I don't think you can talk about technology without also talking about inequality, because there is unequal access. There's unequal experience with high tech in K-12. So students don't all start at university with the same knowledge or use of technology. I think there's differences even in the university setting and certainly beyond. And that's something that concerns me quite a bit, is how do we make sure that in our fostering of technology, we're not somehow fostering inequality at the same time. That is my report to the committee.
Thank you. And over here is Reed Hastings. He's a tech entrepreneur. I'm guessing many of you know, if not by name, of the major innovation that he's the founder and CEO of, a little company called Netflix. And in addition to running Netflix, he's also on the board of governors for Facebook and served in that role as well for a number of years at Microsoft. What is maybe not so obvious from the public presentation or public knowledge about Reed is that he's had a long-standing interest in education that dates back at least to the time that he spent immediately after graduating from Bowdoin College as a Peace Corps volunteer in Swaziland. Soon thereafter, he started a company called Pure Software, which he sold, and immediately thereafter came to Stanford University here to the School of Education, where he enrolled in a bunch of classes in pursuit of a master's degree in education. Around the time he began taking a greater interest as a philanthropist in charter schools and served for a while on the State School Board of Education under Jerry Brown. I think he's also a funder of the Khan Academy. He has since been a signatory to the Gates-Buffett Pledge, which is a public pledge to give away at least 50% of one's wealth in one's lifetime. And in the statements he's made publicly about his philanthropic intentions, he said that he intends to focus the vast majority of those efforts on the reform of public education. And in particular, charter schools are something he's paid a lot of attention to. So with that, turn it over to you, Reed, for comments about technology, social change, and education.
So Aristotle was a pretty good tutor. And if you got Aristotle as your excuse me, personal tutor, you too might end up like Alexander the Great and at 27 to conquer, the entire known world. And so the model of individualized education has proven pretty effective for a very long time. But it's very expensive, and trying to provide Aristotle for every student, it would be a challenge. And fundamentally, the promise of online education is the promise of personalized education. And this idea that all 9-year-olds are, should take the same math class and we should explain fractions in the same way to 39-year-olds is a ridiculous proposition. A third of them are bored, a third of them are frustrated, and a third maybe at best it's about right for. But we've been forced into that through economies of scale, through a factory model, trying to understand, how can we make it cost efficient to get education to everyone so we have 30 in a cell and a bell. So again, the promise of online education is to get it good enough on everything that has a correct answer. So it's math, science, lots of parts of language, some early parts of writing, that the software can take care of that. We free up tremendous amount of teaching resources to focus on the emotional components of working together, seeing other role models besides your parents as adults, thinking, creativity, poetry. That will take a very long time for computers to get good at. For the next 10 or 20 years, we'll be working on everything that's pretty factual, and that you might be with a textbook if you were so motivated. But in fact, with software, it'll get better and better, both at diagnosing what the issues are, helping you. So that's a big promise on that side. I also work a lot, as Rob said, on charter schools, which is a US-specific issue. We're the only nation in the world with local school boards, and that's the fundamental legacy that we have that's unique, and so charter schools are one way to deal with that. And then outside of education, as Rob said, I run Netflix, and I work on House of Cards and Orange is the New Black, and I hope you all get the chance to check out BoJack Horseman. It's our newest show. It's so inappropriately funny, you'll find yourself laughing at things, and you're like, I should not be laughing at that, which is really the essence of great humor.
All right, terrific. So I want to kick conversation off by, maybe jumping into an area of some controversy that involves technology, social change, and in certain respects, an expansive form of education, which is the capacity that new technologies, digital technology in particular, allows for people of all kinds to learn. And what I have in mind here is in part your former job in the Department of Homeland Security, and then Reed, not your educational philanthropic interests, but your job at Netflix, which is a company that has to comply with various rules and regulations of the US government for the provision of information, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes involuntarily, that involve surveillance and the age-old tension between liberty and security, or privacy and security. So in the spirit of advertising new movies or shows, there's a brand new documentary out this weekend about Edward Snowden. And I'd like to start with a question for both of you about Edward Snowden. 2 questions, actually. First, really simple. Is Edward Snowden hero or a traitor? Or if you want to reject the premise and choose your description, please go ahead. But leaving aside your answer to that question, I'm curious to know whether or not you think the country is better off for the national conversation that's been launched in the wake of Snowden's revelations with respect to how we in this country strike the balance between liberty and security. You start with you, Reed.
From what I can tell, Snowden is well-intentioned, slightly naive, but wants to have a good conversation. I think he made some very unfortunate choices in choosing China and Russia as his refuges that undercut his case. And I definitely fear that either Chinese or Russians have taken, or he has given, secrets of our government which will be used against us and used against other people as the price of his asylum. So I'd be a lot more in the whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg case if he had stayed in the US like Daniel Ellsberg and faced those consequences and had a public trial and did not run. Is the conversation better? Slightly, it's certainly bigger. But, I think a lot of people's views on this come down to whether you mostly fear your fellow human beings enabled by anonymity, and whether you view the human state as pretty rough, and if you make it anonymous, bad things can happen, or whether you fear government more, which bad things can happen. And where you line up on that, I think, indicates a lot on how you feel about a lot of these liberty security issues.
Well, I think Reed has put his finger on an important point, which is to say, how do you make yourself the great martyr for or against government overreach and then seek refuge in two countries that practice it on a daily basis? I mean, there's a fundamental inconsistency there. I also believe that there are many legitimate legal avenues for real whistleblowers to use them in Washington, D.C. Lots of them. And it wasn't for one employee to decide on his own what of the United States should be made public and what shouldn't. And particularly when you're dealing in foreign policy, there are lots of issues and there's nuance that needs to be taken into account, none of which he had access to. I think as a result, the conversation and the debate in terms of privacy, security, et cetera, got hijacked. And it got hijacked prematurely, and it got hijacked about him as opposed to about the subject matter area. And that's unfortunate. The debate was already occurring, by the way. It was already happening. If I were to give him any credence, it was for the fact that the debate was not as outside the Beltway as it probably needed to be, and I think would have become overall, because there were committees hearings getting ready to go on in the Congress. There were statutes that were being drafted, et cetera, et cetera. So that conversation was going to occur with or without Edward Snowden. I think a difficult question that we will struggle with the rest of our lives is, what is the right balance? I mean, technology is evolving so quickly. It evolves much more quickly than law can evolve, much more quickly than public policy can evolve. It evolves more quickly than the relations among nations evolve. And so I think that we don't really have that balance in a static way right now. I don't know that we have it right or we have it wrong. I think we have it right most of the time, quite frankly. But undoubtedly, there is going to have to be continued effort in this realm. Why? Because the technology is going to continue to evolve. And by the way, it's issues that involve malefactors that are nation states, but do not forget the increasingly sophisticated nature of the hackers out there, and what their nefarious desires are. They exist, and whether they are there for commercial gain and are going to try to get into a bank account and steal a bunch of money, or whether they exist for a more dubious purpose, you can never tell.
So I want to pick up, go ahead, David.
Well, anecdotally, do I have it right? He was on your watch. You were secretary when the Snowden affair broke. Is that correct?
I was.
So can you give us any sense of how people inside the government reacted? Had you anticipated anything like this? Were there countermeasures in place? What was the reflex reaction of the administration when this broke?
Well, I think Snowden was after Manning, so there had already been a issue of somebody fairly far down in the government making things public without going through the whistleblower channels. And so there were already things underway with respect to that. I think that the initial problem with Snowden is getting a sense of what did he have, what had he actually disclosed, and to whom, and how had he made those choices. And I mean, there was a huge learning curve going on. Obviously, there were things disclosed that were highly embarrassing to the White House that had to be dealt with. And I think that it was a huge, when I say it was a distraction, just unpacking what the heck it was he had. A practical problem was, how did somebody, an employee of a contractor get the keys to the kingdom for all that information? And, there was a lot of finger pointing on that, legitimately so. I mean, it was sloppiness in terms of that. It was sloppiness that evolved in a way because of the desire after 9/11 to break down silos in the government and to have more exchange of information on the theory that there had been, if only silos didn't exist, we would have had a chance to defeat or prevent the attack of 9/11. So there's been a great concentration of agencies and databases and the like. And so if you get a key to one, you get a key to a lot, I think was kind of the realization in the wake of Snowden. But that whole contractor relationship, how those contracts are done, how the security checks are performed, who does the oversight, et cetera, very clearly lots of work needed to be done after Snowden.
Do we now know what he has? Have we figured that out?
I think we know a lot of what he has.
Okay.
So I wanted to pick up on this a little, because I don't actually agree with you, Janet, that we have a good balance on this issue. And by the way, we're going to get into education and technology and stuff, because these guys both know a ton about it. But I think this is a really important point to me personally, and Reed, you know a ton about this too. I think that when it comes to privacy and technology, that first of all, I don't think we passed 2 laws in California in the last 2 years, an eraser button law, which is similar to the right to be forgotten in Europe, for kids under the age of 18. For all of you under the age of 18, this will apply to you as of January 1, 2015. And then this year we passed,
Europe, yeah, right.
And we passed also this year a major Student Online Privacy Information Protection Act. But Congress hasn't passed the privacy legislation since 1998. And so I don't think there is privacy protection. And I think what happened is that guys who run Silicon Valley companies, not Netflix, but some of your colleagues, wrote the laws about privacy, or whatever laws exist, and pray at the altar of data and gobble up data. So I think we have issues with both companies having way too much data about our personal information and the government having way too much data about our personal information. So I don't think we're in balance on that. But I want to ask both of that. And I am concerned about that as a child advocate, because I think kids' privacy matters a ton. I think they don't understand the implications oftentimes of what they reveal, because they get some freebie if they give this information, I think, or they sign a 55-page privacy statement by checking a box at the end of something on their phone. So I don't think and I think it's both a governmental issue and an industry issue.
Yeah,
so I'm going to challenge that for a little before we get into education.
Don't understand me to say that we have reached nirvana here.
Right.
I was talking about that we are going to continue to have to seek what is the right balance, and I was talking with respect to security versus privacy. Now, what private companies are getting for commercial purposes and how they use that, that's another set of issues. And do they have too much, and are they too unregulated with what they can do with information they possess? That's a different issue, a different set of questions.
And that's probably my single biggest concern. Go on, Reed.
I think you're wrong. I think
I knew you were going to say that.
Abuse in the past, when you think about Hoover, running the FBI.
Yeah.
When you think about Nixon using the IRS against his political opponents, these were massive abuses of very specific political opponents, enemies, you know, internal enemies of the state. And for all of the last 4 years of shocking revelations, there has been no specific and credible allegations of the NSA using this to tip elections, to go after the president or anyone else's political enemies. And so I think it's an incredible step forward as a political culture compared to where we were through basically all of the 20th century, where government routinely used information, tax records and other things, and the force of the SBI, the spying against Martin Luther King, all of these things that really has not been part of any of the current story. So it is a little weird that supposedly they can listen to my phone call. I mean, I'm like all of you probably, of like, that's odd. But really, when we think about the health of the political power structures changing in those power structures, it's a miracle. And it's testament, it's got to be testament to a heavy values inculcation on part of multiple administrations about NSA, you know, protect us, but do not, you know, get into commercial, don't give Netflix secrets to Blockbuster and trade on it, you know, or vice versa, and don't interfere in personal lives. And so I think we should take a second and just appreciate how much better we are than 1970, 1960, 1950, 1940, you know, and through all of those eras.
It'll come as no surprise to you that I very much appreciate the historical comparison. but what you're really saying, in effect, is that mercifully we don't have, apparently, any J. Edgar Hoovers or Richard Nixons on the scene right now. But let's say they are reincarnated a generation or two hence. Don't these technologies give them the possibility for vastly more mischief than J. Edgar and Shricky Dick actually were able to pull off?
I think I think that's probably right, which is the weapons. Just think of nuclear war and how much more damaging that could be for an out-of-control ruler. And so what's important is that we mature the political institutions, which is fundamentally the values. So, you know, if you think of the value of civilian control in the military, when you're in the military, it's, you know, drummed into you about the value of civilian control and the fact that senior promotions all need Senate consent as a way of reinforcing that. So you build specific devices in, let's say, in the intelligence community, which is, and the NSA, any senior person in the NSA can tell you, you know what's different from us and the Chinese? We're both very good technologically, but we don't tip elections and we don't make you rich. You know, we work on protecting you. And you can question whether that's good technique or not, but that's like, you know, core bedrock that they build in. And I think it's important, just as the military, we build in a deep philosophy of civilian control, which has been effective at inhibiting military coups that we build in and has, I think, been very successful on the intelligence community side. So I don't want to take it for granted. I think we always need to strengthen that because the possibilities, you know, are horrendous, just like with nuclear war or biological war. You know, they're getting more horrendous. So we keep working on it.
As a general matter, though, you'd resist the idea that the advance of digital technology and the 56 hours a week that our kids are online and the multiple hours a week that adults are online and the exhaust stream of data that is collected partly by companies where we, you know, get the service for free in return for providing our data for companies to monetize, and that sometimes then gets picked up by surveillance activities. Have we shifted the sense of what privacy is? I mean, this is what tech company leaders often say these days, that, you know, what privacy was 20 years ago is different. There's a different social understanding of it. We as an American people are happy to err more in the side of security now than we once were. Do you agree that that social change has taken place and it's okay because we have these robust, you know, internalized values, at least within our political system? Or do you think that the balance has not changed? Technology has made it easier in the way David just described to vacuum everything up. And what the old balance between liberty and security was is the same balance it should be today. We just have to deal with these new technologies in a different way. And it's a regulatory question.
A long question.
Yeah, wow. I'll make it simple. You're right. I was, you know, thinking through this in my head. Has the sense of privacy and its trade-off with security shifted? Yeah. Or is it just new technology and we have to adapt our regulatory structure to strike the old balance with new regulations?
Well, let's not merge everything as technology, privacy, and you can't just use as a throwaway. It either gets monetized by the private sector or you may get picked up by surveillance. we're talking now domestically, not internationally. So international collection of intelligence, that's one thing. But when you talk about domestic, we begin with the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution. There are legal precedents. The Supreme Court is actually in entering the digital age in this respect in terms of the protection of information and what the government can collect, what's a seizure, what they can collect without getting a warrant, what is required for a wiretap. I've done wiretap applications. I was a prosecutor for 10 years. It's not like you watch on TV, and it's a very rigorous process, and you have to continually renew them, showing that you're collecting evidence of a crime in order to keep a wire up. So we have that structure, and the structure needs to be continually adjusted to meet evolving technology. The point I was making earlier is technology, it's evolves more quickly than law does, but we still have protections as U.S. citizens within the United States. What private companies collect and how they want to monetize that and so forth, that's a different issue. And you have to think about that differently. I think in a commercial setting, yeah, we do have a different perspective on privacy. And I just kind of assume that, once I have a Visa card and, my Netflix account, which I keep current, and et cetera, that's not going to be private information. What I want, however, as a consumer is I don't want them making money off of my information. If I want to sell my information, I want to make the money myself.
I bet that'd make the guys at Facebook really happy if we moved to that system.
Visa's made money off that information from you for 20 years.
Yeah.
And so the question is, with technology, is that changing? And I hope that we don't get into an over-regulated scheme, because I think what you'll see is instead a commercial one, and you're seeing that now, where Apple is setting up their brand as the "we don't monetize you" brand. You pay for our devices, and then we don't monetize you. And then Google's setting up as everything's really inexpensive and free, and the ads are appropriate, and therefore it's a net benefit. And people who want one side or the other will have choices, and it's a natural segmentation about people who are more privacy concerned and others who are more value oriented. And so we'll see what segments are catered to, and I think that's fine. And there's just Chip and I were talking about the big Child Protection Act that passed 10 years ago, which said basically if you're below 13, you can't do anything online. And you can see how this is a political impulse to protect kids. And all we do is we teach young kids to lie because they want to be on Snapchat and they want to be on these other services. And they're not supposed to be. And so these simplistic regulatory solutions are popular with politicians because they're popular with people to say they've done something. And so what we have to watch out for is, aiding and abetting that, because it really perhaps not all of these solutions work out better, having these different brands compete. So, there's no question technology is changing, but every new change, having the automobile, it's a big change to society, to living patterns, to commuting patterns, there's tremendous change in U.S. society over 50 years. Television and the advent of that, and first radio and then television, huge changes. We're going through that now with digital. So it's like we've been through it before. It's mostly going to be positive. It's some going to be negative, and we have to learn how to manage those effects. So it's not the first new technology that our society's ever seen.
So let's go. We have so much to talk about in the education realm.
Yeah.
So I do, and I want to actually move on to that. So, Reed, you've been. We all know you from the Netflix role, but I know you from he was that president of the State Board of Education in California, not just a member. You were president of the State Board of Ed. So, and you've been one of the most important figures in the charter school movement. You've actually built some really interesting experimental schools. When you look at technology and K-12 education, what do you see as the future over the next 10 years, say? Technology, and we'll get into the university stuff in a second. What do you see in terms of the next 10 years between K-12 education technologies?
So I'm a big supporter of Dreambox Learning, which does K-5 math programs, and of Khan Academy. And so a number of different approaches. One's a for-profit, one's a non-profit, trying to figure out how to field, large-scale systems in schools. Now, fortunately, the hardware is getting low cost enough and easy enough, and the networks are maturing, and a lot of things are getting very positive on that. And I think more and more schools are open to these hybrid programs. And then the big breakthrough comes when you do enough of it in a school that you're willing to break this idea that the teacher's going to teach fractions. Okay, and if you've still got a system that's like a little bit of homework on this, you can submit homework online. That's pleasant. Okay, but the big breakthrough comes when you go to personalized education, and not every third grader is going to learn the same thing, and some are going to be way ahead, and some are going to be behind, and then you as the teacher are moving around helping different groups, who are at the same level. That's a very different rhythm. And so that's happening only in a very few number of classrooms at Steyer, at Rocketship, at a couple of other charter school networks, which are much less regulated and more innovative, and trying to figure out these new rhythms and grammar for schooling, where you don't have 30 kids being taught the same thing. Right. And that's going to take 10 years to figure out that new rhythm. And what we'll see then is, some kids will be way ahead of where they are today. And this is what you see, in homeschooling. You see the variation in outcome in homeschooling is just dramatic. Some of the top students at Stanford and Harvard homeschooled, and some kids who learn almost nothing. And so, you get that because they get to go at their own pace. And so that's the big thing to watch for. Technology enables it, but it's not about like doing homework online or digital textbooks. I mean, that's like such a small way to look at technology to, oh, I've got a PDF of the textbook and now I don't have paper. You've probably tripled the expense to the total system to deliver that, when you do that as opposed to paper. And it's just a very limited view of it. It really comes down to individualized instruction. And you can think of it as the 9-year-old getting the most appropriate science, math, language instruction.
But do you see that happening? See, on Janet, I know when you were governor of Arizona, you had probably that's the #1 charter school state in the country. But do you see this rolling out at scale over the next 5 years? I mean, that's a because you were. And how? Because you're talking about Rocketship or Aspire. Those are small. Those are tiny number of schools in the bigger context. How do you see that scaling, and how do you see the teacher training professional development piece of that happening?
Well, I think some school
ideas
districts.
On that. I get to go next. Okay,
yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah.
So, do you want to go?
No, go ahead.
So, suburban school districts more or less work, and they'll adopt them at some reasonable pace. The real dysfunction in public education is in large urban districts, and it has
not to mention rural, which is another big
rural,
case.
but very few people live there. So,
it's about 30% of the population.
No.
Yeah. According to the Census Bureau.
What do you call rural?
It's areas unincorporated under 2,500 population. It's about 30% of the U.S. population.
It can't be. We'll come back to that. How do you say bullshit to a historian? I'm probably wrong. But
it's easy to say bullshit.
Oh, I definitely got to get in this conversation.
Okay.
Right. Exactly.
So in large urbans, what's happening is they're going charter in a big way. New Orleans, now 90% of the students in New Orleans are in charter schools.
Yeah, but there's another reason for that. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's called academic achievement. And when you look at New Orleans now, if you track it against all Louisiana State, it used to be way below Louisiana State, and now it's coming up. It's just approaching the average of Louisiana State, and its angle and its improvement's amazing because there's, 24 nonprofits there learning from each other, competing, like Berkeley and Stanford compete, and they exchange ideas. It's just a much healthier system.
Okay, I agree and disagree on some. And I think the original set of questions is how do you do what you're talking about
at
like
scale?
At scale.
And with the teacher training professional development piece too.
Right. So first, we always think of states as are the laboratories of democracy. You ever hear that platitude? I actually think charter schools can be laboratories. I mean, we're testing what works, what doesn't work, et cetera, et cetera. One of the advantages of online learning is the ability to continually, for a student to continually be assessed by a teacher and to check him or herself. and to get to more competency or outcome-based evaluation. You know, it's not about sitting in a classroom 100 and some odd days a year. It's about, did you learn how to do this? Do you know how to do this? You know, et cetera, et cetera. And once you know those things, well, then you can move on to the next grade. And online, I think properly used can do that. The hardware cost is coming way down. I think for large school districts, what would be very helpful is if the tech industry kind of put together you know, and were willing to help contribute a startup package, you know, so you could do something to scale, get the hardware in, and some people who know how to operate it, so that larger districts, poorer districts have access to it. Rural districts have access to it, you know, because they're going to need it, because it's, you know, it's a better way to learn properly done. With respect to the teacher part, you know, I think my experience with the teacher community is that they want to be good educators, and I think we can and we ought to be supporting them in that era or that area, which is to say, how do you combine the tech part with what you want to do in your classroom? Because it's got to be a hybrid. It's got to be a mix of things. And how do you use technology so that it allows you and empowers you to spend more time with students who need your time?
So we had Linda Darling-Hammond.
And by the way, New Orleans, I can't leave New Orleans.
I agree.
The reason New Orleans isn't a good model is because because of the tragedy of Katrina, they got to do what no other school district has been able to do, which was almost start from scratch. And the only way they've been able to do it so well is they got a huge amount of money from the federal government. Ironically, going into a state where the state government and the governor oppose the federal government, but they will take the check. And they've taken a huge amount. And they've been able to like start afresh, which has been great for the kids of New Orleans. But we're not going to have Katrinas around the country. So we have to say, all right, how do we do this more generically? Yeah, or more organically.
And DC's at 45%. So that's the next leading city. So you're right that New Orleans, because of the tragedy, is a look into the future.
Yeah.
But it's a look into the future in terms of how the lotteries work, how special ed works. A lot of that is being worked out, you know, with doing things at scale.
Yeah.
And now other cities, Los Angeles is at 12% and growing. And, you know, if we think about Palo Alto, there's no charter schools because by and large people are happy. And in East Palo Alto, there's 6. Because often people are unhappy with the school system.
Right.
So it's got
That's
you know, a natural rhythm, and it's what does it look like when, you know, most kids, at least in low-income communities, have the option of charters in the way that kids in high-income communities have the option of private schools. So that's what we're building towards.
Yeah.
I just have one follow-up question on this because it's important. You both know a ton about this. So Reed, you know from Dreambox and Khan Academy and some of the other stuff that you've been very involved in, and Rocket Ship, et cetera, where you're very involved. So that is a fundamentally different way of teaching than the old skill and drill method. My question, and to you, but it's also then Janet to look at it because you're now the head of UC, is where are we going to invest? Teachers just don't change that way. It's a different form of lesson planning. It's a different, technology is a tool. You guys have both said that. Where are we going to get the time and resource to invest in retraining those teachers? Because I don't think you just give them a Dreambox learning system, or I mean, so how do you deal with that at scale? If we're really going to go in this direction, but we'll get to the universal learning. How are you going to do that at scale?
Well, I think we've got a long way to go to figure that out. It's probably at least another 5 years of just figuring out the core software and operators before you even try to take it to scale. So, and if you take it too early, then it's like this, really terrible implementation, and then the whole idea falls apart. So I don't think anybody's looking to say, let's take this to scale at this point. The rhythms are really just starting to be worked out about how do you do about the kid who's way behind? How do you, there's a lot of things that have been developed with 30 and Cell and a Bell and social promotion and various things you do that, we've had 150 years of it. So it's going to take another, half dozen years in special laboratory situations and schools to try to figure out, oh, it works if you do this, but not this, before we take it to scale. So there's always a political thirst for, give me the answer now, save the kids now, we got to go now, we got to go now. And we have to have the discipline to say it's not ready, it doesn't work at scale. We've got some more years of evolution. And this is the problem, like for those of you who followed LAUSD. And, John Daisy's a great guy. He couldn't ask for a better superintendent. He spends $1 billion on iPads, and the whole thing's a train wreck of, because he had one shot with his board to get a $1 billion bond passed to get this thing going. And so he gets $1 billion worth of iPads and hands them out. And, the kids use the back of them and draw on them. And it's like ridiculous, right? Because they had to do it all at once because of what he perceived to be the political dynamic. As opposed to, let's do like any normal organization does. Let's experiment a little, let's try this. But they're all like, we got to do it today. We got to do it today. And that's the unfortunate, the political pressure that local school boards are under.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, which is why thinking about some of these systems, like some of the charter schools or some school districts that are further along, using them and really looking at them as pilots and taking the best of them, and it advances like that in a stair step, not just one big bang. The other thing that we need to ask our colleges of education is, how do you train a teacher for tomorrow? It's the same thing we're asking our colleges of medicine. How are you training the doctor of tomorrow? And really forcing ourselves to say, what are we going to be, 5, 10 years down the road? What are the skill sets that these professionals are going to have? And I suspect in most colleges of education, there needs to be a lot of change to be thinking in those terms as opposed to only skill and drill.
When the conversation about the application of these new technologies to education really started to get traction, let's say roughly a decade ago or so, maybe even a little less than that, much of the cutting edge of that conversation was how this would be cost saving. That you could deliver lots of quality education to a lot more people at a very, very low price. So there was an elision made between high tech and cost saving. Is that realistic? Or in fact, if we do it properly and well, as terms we keep using, at the end of the day, will this turn out to be an incremental cost, not a cost saving set of tools?
I think you can answer that by looking at medicine and saying, has technology reduced the cost of medicine or risen the expectations? The answer is risen the expectations. We expect really good treatment in ways that were not possible 30 years ago. And technology enables a lot more for your dollar, but our society will fund education at the level that we're comfortable with, and hopefully that will continue to increase, and there'll be independent variables.
Yeah, I think, particularly in the higher education arena, the whole MOOCs, massive online learning phenomenon, which would somehow dramatically reduce the cost of getting a college degree while sustaining the quality. And that just hasn't proven to be the case. San Jose State is a good example of how that can go awry. But out of that kind of mistake has come a lot of learning about, well, how is technology? How does online really augment the student experience? How does it give students more options, not fewer? How does it allow us to reach a larger group of people who may want to continue to receive higher education courses? And what's the best way to do that? How does it maximize the time actually in a classroom, a lab, or a design studio, as opposed to simply sitting in a lecture, so that the professor and the TAs, that's where they're spending the time with the students. So I think the original thought that it was going to blow up higher education and we were going to totally change everything that's being done, et cetera, has not proven out. The fact that it's a massive savings of money has not proven out. But I do think there is a broad recognition that this will be an ongoing tool, part of the toolbox of a higher education.
But at the end of the day, once we studied all these case studies and figured out best practices and are doing it right, let's say it's a decade or 2 decades hence, will there be a fiscal dividend, a technology dividend that on net will be spending less or more for education?
Oh, I don't think we'll be spending less.
So you agree with Reed? Medicine is the example that we should look to.
I think, but I think we won't be spending less, but we will be spending better.
Let's hope so.
And do you think it's going to transform UC? I mean, when you look out, right, do you think it's going to transform UC into a very different university system than it is today or not?
If by a very different university system, you mean one where we empty the classrooms and reduce the number of faculty, et cetera, no. I don't think that's the way we ought to look at it. This is going to be an issue in California because there are some in Sacramento who think it ought to totally reform, not reform, but change the University of California. And I don't think that's right. I think we ought to be looking at technology as what it is. It is a tool that can enhance the learning experience. But the notion, there was actually a very interesting exchange at a Regents meeting last year between the provost of the University of California and the governor. And the governor is very interested in, and got interested early in online education. Got interested early in MOOCs. That's fine. That's good. A lot of people have been. And I think, it's all about advancing, but it was also about, okay, and he was really putting it to the provost about why won't it reduce costs? And why can't we reduce faculty, et cetera? And she was trying to explain why, in terms of education and education outcomes, it just hasn't proven out to be that way. And he was really pushing her, finally to the point of, well, why do you need, she was trying to explain, you need some interaction with the professor. You need at some time to be in a classroom. That, you need at some point to have a discussion with your fellow students, et cetera. And he was really pushing her as to why you need that at all. Why can't you just watch a class, watch it online? And why do you have to have anything interactive there? And I almost leaned over to say, that's called reading a book. I mean, that's but he was really pushing that. Yeah. Because he was pushing us to make the best use of the resources we can. What we can't say is just that technology is somehow this silver bullet that will enable us to provide a high quality education and produce the kind of thinkers that we expect and somehow be able to do it without costing any money. That just is not reality.
Can I jump in here about technology education, hearkening back to earlier parts of the conversation that Reed, you touched on, where you compared, I thought I heard you compare what we might expect from personalized forms of learning that are mediated through technology to the kind of distribution of outcomes we see perhaps in homeschooling, where you get real peaks of achievement on the one hand, and then people who don't learn much at all. So if it turns out that the advent of technologically mediated one-on-one personalized forms of learning make possible rapid advancement of those who have native talent, willingness to work hard, internal motivation, and not especially rapid advancement for those who lack any of those three things, what do you predict will be the case with respect to the distribution of educational achievement or academic achievement when we have 5, 10 years really well-functioning one-on-one personalized learning environments? Will we see greater educational inequality and gaps, but really exceptional achievement at early ages? Or can the technology actually be an equalizing force with respect to educational distribution of achievement?
I think it's not going to work as an equalizing force, but it will change the boundaries to be not as much race and class as they are now and income, and to be much more genetic lottery. And so if you're born and you win the genetic lottery, but you're in a low-income family, you'll have an incredible opportunity to be doing, a college-level math in 8th grade. So, it'll be a tremendous kind of equal up to the genetic lottery. And so easier to take as a society, because what's difficult is when it feels preordained by your zip code or your ethnicity. And somehow we get comfortable like athletic prowess being quite unevenly distributed. And we say, well, that's nature. And those are the people who won the genetic lottery, and they're an incredible athlete or musician. It's another area where we're comfortable with a talent. So I mean, even the low performing and individualized will be much higher than the average today. So, it'll move everybody up. But the top end will really, they're so held back and so bored today in most classes. And, they're, I think, very well distributed across the population.
One of the things that people say about MOOCs these days is that, they always cite the high dropout rates. Lots and lots of people sign up, but many, a small number complete them.
Yeah. That was the San Jose.
Yeah, that's part of the San Jose experiment. Now, whether or not, some people say that's a good thing. People are dipping in to try something brand new, and it turns out they don't like it, and they got the thing for free, and so it's actually a signal of success that the enrollment is so high, and the dropout rate we shouldn't worry too much about. But I think part of what's going on there, plausibly part of what's going on there, is that online education in this MOOC or one-on-one style works really well if the motivation already exists in the student to try to access the material. And just as you said, if you happen to have bad luck, born into a poor family, you can't. Now you have you have a point of access, and that really opens up opportunity.
It's a little like saying sugar and cocaine. They're both white powders. So, I mean, MOOCs and individualized are the opposite. A MOOC is everybody massive, all doing the same thing. That's like the very opposite of what I'm talking about. Okay, so
you can put the video at 1.5
they're
speed.
both online, like they're both white powders.
Yeah.
But
right.
Okay, so remember that a MOOC is a fad. It's like, it's like a big lecture series online. Okay, and that has all that self-motivated.
This class.
The other thing, this is the cocaine. I'm talking about the sugar, which is a motive. Why do students not like learning? Because they feel dumb sometimes, because they don't get the material, because they're not motivated. So if you've got a proper online system, you've got a range of motivational techniques, coming out of video gaming, coming out of achievement, and what's success and building your score. And you've got a range of them for different personality types as you flush out the portfolio. And it's always just at the edge of your learning level. So, if you really suck at fractions, it's not doing calculus. And the big turnoff on all these things is I don't understand. Okay, but if it builds your confidence at the right level, you get more interaction. And so, yeah, there's a lot of problems with MOOCs, but they have nothing to do with individualized, which is back to the individual tutor. When you got one-on-one from your parent or from a professional tutor, or a few minutes with the teacher, it's an incredible experience. So it's trying to build on that modality rather than, a million people in a stadium, learning, which is the MOOC style. But they are both online, just like they're both white powders.
So we've just discussed Aristotelian cocaine. Okay, I just wanted to, make sure we had it. Okay.
But Janet, can you tell us what happened with? What happened with San Jose State? Because I don't actually know, and I'll bet you a lot of people in the audience don't. What did they do? Because I actually think it's important. That's an important university, not very far from here. What happened and what went wrong with that?
The way I understand it, I wasn't in higher ed at the time. I was at DHS,
right.
But I believe that they, set aside a large amount of their budget to basically instill or use MOOCs in the curriculum. Reed may know more than I do.
Yeah, I was. To high level, they just went too fast. They got seduced by the overnight transformation. Right. And large institutions don't and shouldn't overnight transform. And, they learned the lesson, they got burned. And it doesn't mean we should never do it. It's just like It's a measured process of learning class by class. How do we help kids learn more?
Well, and again, going back to that theme of being able to pilot, being able to think of these things as laboratories. One of the things that happens, our experiments fail, and you learn from that, and you go and you move on. So, and they have in very significant ways.
You know, I actually think this is for this broader issue, the ability to go at the pace you're suggesting, Reed, I think is going to be critical. Because I do think, with what happened to John, what is happening to John Daisy in LA right now, because it hasn't totally played out yet, as you know, is quite interesting, because there is going to be this demand to have technology as a lever for mass scale reform. And what you're suggesting, and by the way, in the private sector, it does play out a whole lot faster than it does in the public sector or in an educational context. But your suggestion is that we're really going to have to experiment with this for another 5 or 10 years before you could really roll it out on any significant scale, correct? I mean, I think that's it. And the question is that also going to be true at the university level? Because if that's true, that's a very different set of expectations that are out there right now in a lot of the discussions I'm in, certainly about education reform and technology. You really see that pace being necessarily much slower than we can handle.
Again, to have kids have a computer, it won't take that long because they're getting cheap, and everyone will say, don't you have a computer? And just writing your papers, it's good to have a computer. To move, but it's only going to, learning will increase a little. The breakthrough comes when you get Aristotle, when you get individualized education and the personalized learning. And that's much harder. That takes this, learning, a very different rhythm with the teaching. Think of end-of-year exams that we have as the state of California has end-of-year exams, and we test third grade math for 9-year-olds. Okay, and it's like, wow, how long is it going to take to change that? I mean, that's a long time, right? And that, so yeah, that's why that individualized stuff is the big promise, and that's going to take longer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I think that just think about about timescales, and you're right. In the private sector, you want to roll out a new product, you want to do this or that, you can move very, very fast, and competition requires that. But it's just. That's just the way it is, because you're trying to find a market, you're trying to sell something, you're trying to make some money. When you're talking about large public institutions where there are lots of different things going on, and you never have enough money, and the consequences of doing a big thing and having it fail are dire, because now you've got $1 billion of of money for the public schools that could have been what the opportunity cost of that is very significant for young people, for those young kids. So the media and kind of our political brains want quick answers that are immediate, but really good public policy requires, the discipline to, have a plan, phase it in, be willing to backtrack if it's not working well, adjust as you go along, and to hold true with something for, multi-year periods to really instill. And that's what I think technology in the K-12 level is going to require. And I think it will, over a decade or so, be a major change in how students learn. But it is not going to be done by somebody writing a big check and just saying, okay, bingo, the light switch is on.
Hardware for all.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
But that's the scary stuff about LA, because we're no, it is, because I agree with you that John has a bold vision and is actually a really fine
good superintendent.
And it could absolutely tank now. And you could set back. There's a big deal in the K through 12 system if that tanks, because it'll scare people away.
It should. I mean, it's like the San Jose University case. So, it's too much, too fast, and they need to go more steady.
So look, this session this evening was advertised as technology and social change, and you teed up a few aspects of this other than just education when we began it. I'd be the last person to say that education is not important, but there is life after school. So what if we just look into that dimension for a little bit, the world of work and employment and what the demography and opportunities, constraints on the workforce look like going forward. And just to get us started, I'd like to just quote you a few sentences from a presidential commission that investigated this matter and remarked on, I'm now quoting, "The frequency with which new machines displace laborers, making their services at former tasks no longer necessary. There are so many new inventions indicating displacement of labor that technological unemployment may be an even more serious problem of the future than it is now. The widespread introduction of machinery is having the general effect of replacing skilled with semi-skilled and unskilled labor and is thus reducing the status of the trained and skilled worker, if in fact it is not tending to eliminate him entirely from many industries. Technological changes in industries lead often to the total displacement of labor." Now that happens to be a study commissioned by Herbert Hoover in 1929 and published in 1933, so this is hardly a new idea. But those predictions appeared, in retrospect, were really pretty far off the mark, that those people who were displaced by machine innovation in those days were, after a decade of horrendous economic displacement, were reabsorbed into the workforce for the next several generations. So what, if anything, do you think is different about the kind of technological changes in the workforce today compared to other stages of the Industrial Revolution?
Well, there are two things to think about, at least two. One is, the kinds of kind of mechanical changes that happen to fill in that gap in the manufacturing world were pretty logical incremental add-ons. One wonders at what point, if ever, do we actually reach the end of the everybody has a job economy in terms of producing what people need. Are we at the edge of something that where we can't even, human beings just, what more is needed, or what more would change? And I think the advent of the kind of technology we're talking about now is very different than the kind of technology that was being looked at the end of the 20s and the beginning of the 30s. So that's one. The second is the globalized nature of economics today, and the fact that so much of what is we can't control and substitute jobs that went away during the recession with similar jobs now in the United States because they exist in other countries, and because with the developments in travel and trade and the like, the world is just linked economically much more so than it was then. And so that, I think, is an opportunity, but also a constraint on job growth domestically.
If you look over 10,000 years from the advent of people living together for purposes of protecting agriculture and society, we've had, tremendous amounts of change. I mean, the amount of change introduced by iron, the amount of change introduced by warfare, with cannons, the amount of change introduced by ships, by airplanes, by travel, by disease. I mean, and then, more recently, the agricultural, fall of agricultural workers to industrial, and now industrial to service. So society has an incredible ability to adapt, and it'd be extremely hard for me to believe that suddenly we've come to the end of that. And it's much more likely that we humans just limit and don't have enough imagination. When you think about Malthus writing, 220 years ago about, we're all going to starve because you can't produce enough food for the growing population, and we're condemned forever to live in poverty, and starvation and misery, and it's like many people could believe that. And, that hasn't happened. Why? Because humans have continued to invent. And it's not one thing. It's that humans are creative. And whether we invent swords, you know, and have a breakthrough in warfare, or the plow and have a breakthrough in agriculture, or seeds and all these, you know, we continue to invent. And what Malthus really missed is the more people there are in the world, the more ideas there are, and the more invention there is. And inventions are great because they replicate across all of society. A couple people come up with some idea, like cotton gin, and you know, the enormous numbers of people get to use it. And so the intellectual capital that we've developed, you know, think first about written language and how long that took to get written language, and then what a breakthrough that was. And then to think about written language becoming in books and low-cost distribution of it with Gutenberg. I mean, you know, it took a few people coming up with those ideas. And now, you know, we have 7 billion people thinking about how to improve the world. And so I think we should be super optimistic about what technology will bring. And there'll be issues, there's no question. I mean, you could say, yeah, things have been great, except for that Black Plague. You know, that wiped out, you know, a third of the world, and, you know, that's awful, and that could happen again, but the world kept going, you know, despite that. So I think we should be very optimistic and embracing of technology of various sorts. You know, we were talking earlier, to me, the open race is, you know, in 100 years, what are the post-human life forms? And, you know, one side, there'll be computer-based artificial intelligence, kind of silicon-based intelligence. And then the other, there'll be augmented human beings that are both augmented with digital, but are basically DNA-based. And then depending on how well we can manipulate DNA, these sort of superhumans that make us look like crazy people, you know. And so, I mean, there's just tremendous things that will happen over the next 100 years. So I wouldn't worry about...
let me bring that back to the
Wait a minute. Wait.
the short term.
Yeah,
Just a slightly less speculative.
Yeah, go
on. Something neither one of you mentioned, and I don't know, it's in my mind, but I don't know what to make of it, and I'm curious what you do.
Yeah.
In terms of changes in terms of life and people's working life, isn't it at least possible to imagine that technology will mean we'll work less? That our working lifespan will be lesser, we'll retire at an earlier age, we'll work fewer hours per week, they'll have more leisure, more creative time, more discretionary time. Isn't that a possibility?
So I was dealing with maybe you and I were talking about different time frames.
We warned you about it.
And anyway, so I think that's, you put in more articulately what I was trying to get at, which is to say, in the near term, what work is going to substitute for the work that has been lost, due to the productivity gains that technology now has provided. And I will accept the Reed's postulate that humanity always figures something out, and we always have. But I think we're going to be in a period now of dislocation, and I think we need to be acknowledging that as a country, and taking steps to help people who are today caught in that, and we don't have an easy way out for them. It's not like we can give them a job. The job doesn't exist. It either doesn't exist because of productivity gains made or because it's been moved to another country. And that is, I think, one of the serious public policy issues of our day that nobody is actually talking about, frankly, and acknowledging that, you know what, there is no government program, there is no manufacturing boom, we don't yet know what to do.
Oh, and instead we do the opposite. So we destroy jobs by taxing labor. So think of the Great Depression. What was the big mistake in the Great Depression? Oh, jobs are down, so let's put tariffs up. And we drove global trade, you know, down, and we significantly worsened the Great Depression. And out of those lessons, you know, we avoided that in 2008. But there's other things we don't do. So, I mean, you all probably believe in healthcare and Obamacare and, you know, let's make businesses pay. But you basically double the cost of labor for low-end jobs. And so we're systematically eliminating and taxing low-end jobs, because you add on now, if you bring on a new employee, you got to add this full burden of health care. And it really ought to be health care paid by the general tax provider and be independent of jobs. But when we attach these things to jobs and retirement and all these other things, we're driving up the cost of labor in ways that people in business are forced to then eliminate all of those jobs. So not only is there, we don't know what to deal with it, but there's not a real dialogue about it. Instead, the only politically viable way to get health care was to make businesses pay for it. Businesses have money. But we do it on a, for each employee, which then, if you increase the cost of the input, you're going to get less coming out. So it's unfortunate that we and the politicians aren't really to blame, it's really the people, because the politicians are just a reflection of the people. We don't have, the economics is very hard. And, in the Great Depression, we made great mistakes. We made less this time. So, we're on the positive vector. But we're making real mistakes right now of taxing jobs in a very significant way at the low end. At the high end, it doesn't really matter, but at the low end, it does.
So is the implication there that you prefer not that people don't have health care if they can't afford it on their own, but that rather than impose the cost on businesses, there be collective payments, and that there's basically a tax and transfer program to provide for these basic services, including supports for people dislocated in the labor market to transition to something new? So it's not just health care, retirement, but also sort of job training programs, not provided through business, but provided through the state.
Well, I wouldn't assume that we know the jobs we would retrain people for. That's what I'm saying. It's much more difficult question. I mean, we know how to do job training programs. We know what the job is. The jobs don't exist, and that's the problem.
Partially, the jobs don't exist, and we're systematically driving them out and making it cheaper to do these other things, because we do these, these politically viable routes. And yes, I think if all of that wasn't attached to individual employment, and the real cost of hiring a $9 an hour person was $9 an hour, you'd see significantly more. In fact, instead, the real cost of hiring a $9 an hour person is $20 an hour. Okay, so it's just a practical supply and demand trade-off. But the government's not able to really deal with that because it doesn't have another tax source. But if it came from the general tax revenue, we'd have a lot more jobs. So, we've got, we're learning, we're getting better, as a society. These things are hard. Just think about money. I mean, money's an incredible invention. That we trust it, that's crazy. And that's only been in the last couple hundred years. So, I complain about these things like the government policy, but on balance, we are really making great progress.
Janet, I have a question. I think it's an incredibly important issue. What do you see a role for UC? We got a bunch of questions online about this. Do you see a role for UC in dealing with this, in actually looking at the work and changing UC's role in some way in preparing people for jobs differently, and even retraining existing people who no longer really have the skill set that they need? Do you see that as anything to do with your role at UC, or no?
I think it's somewhat. I think big public universities, we have three missions. One is the teaching mission. One is the research mission, and particularly basic research, which has been outsourced from the private sector to universities. The private sector doesn't really do basic research anymore. And then public service, and to help grapple with what are the big public policy problems today, and how can we as a society best deal with them. We can do that in a couple of ways. One is by thinking about what we teach and how we teach it. That's a little bit about what we discussed earlier this evening. We can do it by identifying one or two big issues and putting the collective weight of different disciplines around the university behind it. We're doing one right now on global food security, one of the big issues for the planet now and for the foreseeable future. I think that's an interesting question when you say, what about the big, if not the biggest economic issue in the United States today, which is inequality, and how you deal with it, and how do you replace work with what work has been lost, and how perhaps you actually reframe the concept of work. yeah, I think we do have and can have a role there. That's one of the reasons why it's great to have universities. I mean, it's one of the things they can do.
But it's also the case that, at least in California, there's 3 tiers of post-secondary education structure. There's the UC system, the CSU system, and the community colleges.
And then Stanford.
And then, yeah, okay. then there's the private.
Stanford, okay. Stanford.
But it seems to me that
Pandering.
the institutional layer that is most directly engaged with Jim's question is the community colleges.
Yeah.
Where
For job training sort of things and that kind of thing, perhaps.
And retraining.
And retraining.
Yeah.
Absolutely on the retraining part. And they really were set up for that. I mean, they're in every county. There are 100 and some odd community college districts, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, that was actually part of the vision that
there are societies answer to the old apprenticeship system. I mean, they serve that kind of function.
Indeed. Well, and both for training and retraining.
Yeah, and one follow-up is, I mean, Reed, don't you think industry has a role in that too? I mean, seriously, you're one of the people in the industry who actually does look at stuff in a big picture. Don't you think industry has, if industry is creating some of those challenges, don't they have a role in trying to rethink that, particularly in a state like California?
I don't know that they would be particularly effective. The thing to remember about business is it's so competitive. You know, I mean, HBO is trying to kill us. We're trying to kill them. You know, it's like it's so consumptive that most companies don't have that many skills outside of their area.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure you want them being like the public policy theorists because they're just not selected for that. It's like, you know, it's like winning in a football season. It's like it takes all of your focus to do a great job and a better job than the other people. So I think it's better probably just to tax them, not on the jobs, but on revenue and other things, and then you know, have other people be thinking through how do we have a societal context like a legal system and, you know, and other things that then support the greater society.
So Reed, just not so incidentally, how many people do you employ?
About 4,000.
And you deliver X number of films to X times Y number of customers in every unit of time. So what would be the analog of how many people went to movie theaters 50 years ago or something? What would be the
probably the simpler one would be Blockbuster employees because there were 50,000. So it's sort of a 10 to 1 or something.
Blockbuster was 50,000, you're 4,000?
Yeah. So you could do a 10 to 1 of job replacement.
You deliver more product to more people.
That's right.
So there's 46,000 jobs plus that have been displaced, and what do we do with them?
Well, I think what happens is in the overall economy, what we've seen is when you get displacement, that there's a lot of other avenues for those people to contribute. And so, but, you know, look, we've had companies rising and falling, you know, as long, you know, as we've had society. And it's very tough on the individual. And a lot of what people do is they invest in continuing education. They try to figure things out. But I don't mean to minimize it. It's hard. But it's better than the alternative, right? The alternative is that you keep the old farm organization intact and you never rationalize it and you get, you know, massive inefficiency. So what we do have to do, I think, as a caring and thoughtful society is reduce the inequality and to have a number of options for people to take initiative and to be able to do that. I doubt if the government takes responsibility for retraining, it's going to end up being that effective. But we can support the set of people who want to learn something new, and we could start there.
I was prepared for an expansive and wide-ranging conversation under the title of Technology and Social Change, but I just want to, you know, mark for a moment that one of the things I'm taking away from the roughly 90 minutes we spent together is that we should have some optimism about not merely the capacious, inventive characteristics of humankind and their capacity to adapt to disruptions in the social fabric that are brought upon us by technology. But also that as the technology with respect to education matures, we can expect that the genetic lottery is going to be a much more significant determinant of educational outcomes and therefore in society in terms of the winners and losers.
That's Reed's theory.
That's Reed's theory. You haven't signed on to that.
I have not signed on to that. Let the record show.
Right, all right. But
she likes the part where you get the genetic manipulation, which equalizes.
Right, I was going to say. So, but then the genetic lottery goes away because human inventiveness is so great, we'll modify our DNA and gene structure itself for equalizing or disequalizing purposes, I'm not sure, in order that the machines don't best us in the long run.
Right, it's carbon versus silicon.
Carbon versus silicon.
So that's the
And
race.
don't forget Aristotelian cocaine. So
I know.
it has to be in it.
By the way, that's going to be the title of a new Netflix show. I mean, when you said that before, I just see Reed thinking, okay, that's a great title.
You know, one of the best documented historical instances of technological displacement that had cascading social effects was the mechanization of American agriculture in the late 19th century, which flooded European markets with very low-priced grains especially, and put all kinds of marginal subsistence-level European farmers out of business. And what happened to them? A lot of them came to the United States to be industrial workers. I'll bet a lot of Napolitanos, like a lot of Kennedys, got here just exactly for that kind of reason. So that raises a very speculative prospect about the future, that maybe as these effects of displacement go on more deeply in our society, maybe we will become, for the first time in our history, a people exporting country. People will be so displaced that they'll start looking for opportunity elsewhere.
Open borders, we're on the way.
All right.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. What is the movie? There was a disaster movie. I forget the title of it. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
There's been many.
Anybody knows.
But there's this
Just a
huge
ship
flood,
sank.
you know, flooding the United States, flooding North America, United States, and people are trying to flee into Mexico to get out of the way.
Yeah.
And they had a border fence up and
Yeah, it
guards
was the
and
one
wouldn't
where
let
the
anybody
weather reverses.
Yeah, yeah,
And it was so cold.
yeah, yeah. So anyway.
What's it called?
I don't know. Some disaster movie.
Day after tomorrow?
Was it
It was
Day After Tomorrow?
Yeah.
Okay, anyway. So you never
It was
know.
it was a great laugh line.
Yeah.
Crossing the Rio Grande, getting out.
Well,
The ice age is coming back.
I got to say, this has been an incredibly interesting conversation. We had no idea it was going to go here. But boy, we have not had two more interesting guests than Reed and Janet Napolitano. Thank you guys very much. These are great discussions. These are great discussions. This is great.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.